So this is the structure of our vehicle resource object. Now for simplicity, I've excluded some of the properties that we're not going to talk about in this lecture. Now this structure works perfectly fine when we want to edit a vehicle. So in our vehicle edit form, we call our API, get the makes, models, and features. And since we have their IDs here, we can easily select the vehicle's model in the drop-down list and also select the checkboxes for its features. However, this structure does not work when we want to render the list of vehicles like this. So here we want to show the actual make or the actual model, not their ID. With our current design, if you want to implement a page like this, we have to make two API calls, get the makes and models, and get the vehicles, and then join them on the client side to display their make and model. And this is a little bit tedious. We have to write a little bit of ugly code. So what should we do here? Well, one solution is to add name properties. So just like we have model ID, we can have model name. However, this solution gets ugly pretty quickly. Imagine if we have 5 other attributes about a vehicle. For each attribute, we should add 2 properties in our API resource, an ID property and a name property. It's really ugly. Plus, we have totally ignored the concept of data structures. We use a data structure to group or encapsulate related properties. So this model ID and model name should really be part of a data structure. So the second solution is to use nested JSON objects. Here, instead of model ID, we have model, which is a complex object with 2 properties, ID and name. We can extend this and use the same approach with our features. So our features array now has a bunch of complex objects, each having an ID and a name. However, it looks like we're going back to where we started, because this API resource looks almost identical to our domain class. So why did we go through all this effort of creating this API resource? Well, let me refresh your memory. There are 2 reasons for creating API resources. One is to prevent the API contract from breaking. Because as we implement new features in our application's domain model constantly evolves and changes. And if we expose these domain classes outside our APIs, the clients dependent on this API may break as a result of changes in our domain model. The second reason we create API resources is to prevent overposting attacks. So, as I showed you earlier, certain properties should not be set by the client. The last update property was one example. So, our domain classes might have several properties, but our API resources should have only the properties needed for creating or updating data, nothing more. The issue we're facing here is that we're using one API resource for 2 different purposes. When creating or updating a vehicle, we need a simple JSON object like this. Here we only need the IDs. We don't need the names. A simple array of numbers is sufficient to represent the features. We don't want complex objects here. However, when getting a vehicle, we need a different structure, a different API resource. And this API resource is a complete representation of a vehicle. And more importantly, here, it's perfectly fine to add this last update property. So earlier, we set this last update on the server, but nowhere we have displayed this to the user. So what's the point of that? Maybe somewhere on a page, we want to show the last time a vehicle was updated. Now, because this API resource is only for read-only purposes, it's perfectly fine to add this last update property here. Now you might be a little bit skeptical and say, Mosh, with this approach, we end up with an explosion of classes. Why can't we reuse the same API resource in different actions? Well, think of a function in any programming language. A function has an input and an output, right? Has anyone ever told you that all the functions in your application should have the same input or the output type? Of course not. Every function may need a different input and or output type depending on its purpose. So our createVehicle function or action in MVC terms should have a parameter of type saveVehicleResource. This is the simplified API resource that includes only the identifiers. Plus, it doesn't have the last update property. Our updateVehicle action can use the same type as its parameter. However, our getVehicle action needs to work with a different resource type, vehicle resource. And here we have a complete representation of a vehicle. The IDs, the names, and the last update property are all included in this object. Now here we're working with a simple application. In a more complex application, sometimes certain properties cannot be updated. They can only be set once when creating an object. In that case, these two actions would need different types as their parameters. So for create vehicle action, we need a parameter of type create vehicle resource. And for update vehicle action, we need a parameter of type update vehicle resource. You can think of these resources as command objects. Each command is an object that includes the data for the action we're going to perform. So the action can be creating a vehicle or updating a vehicle. Now, in this simple application, this is an overkill. So we can simply reuse the same type save vehicle resource as the parameter of these two different actions. So next, we're going to do this refactoring to make our APIs more usable.